Hello, and welcome back to another Eduonics tutorial. In this section, we're going over effects and techniques in Photoshop. And in this video, we'll be going over a few different ways to make a vignette. I already touched on vignettes in a previous video, but since we're on the subject now, I'll just go over it again to refresh your memory. Basically, a vignette is a very soft, dark border around the edges of your image, usually drawing focus to the centermost part of the image, in either a circle or oval shape. In this video, I'll be going over 3 different ways to make a vignette. To start off on my first method, I'll just go to my Layers panel and drag my locked background layer to the new layer icon to duplicate it. Then, with the duplicate layer still selected, I'll go down to the bottom of the Layers panel and click the Layer Effects button. Then, I'll click Gradient Overlay. Now in the Layer Style dialog box, I'm going to go over to my Blend mode, and I'll change it from Normal to Multiply. The Multiply blend mode removes white, so we're left with just the black portion of the gradient. Now I can actually see through my gradient and get a better idea of how it will blend with the layer. Then I'll go down to Style and change that from Linear to Radial. This is basically giving me a circle gradient, which is what I want for my vignette. But remember, I want to darken the outside edges of my layer, not the middle. So I'll go up to this box where it says Reverse, and I'll check it to reverse my gradient. Now I'll increase the size of my gradient by going down to Scale, and I'll increase that all the way to 150. That's better, but it's still a bit too small. I want to see more of my image. So my trick here is to go to Angle, and I'll pull that clockwise till I get to about 0 degrees. Then I'll just click OK to apply my gradient. There we go. There's a very easy way to make a simple circular vignette. And if I want to change any settings, like the vignette's opacity, I can just double click my layer effect and bring down the opacity whenever I want. I'm going to delete this layer effect so I can move on to my next method. Okay, now for the second method in making a vignette. I noticed that whenever people are making a vignette, they like to go up to the Tools panel and get the elliptical marquee tool. Then they just drag an oval onto the layer to use in their vignette. I don't agree with just dragging the oval and aligning it by eye alone. I prefer to make the vignette perfectly straight and centered onto my canvas. I have a very quick and easy way to do this. I'm going to go ahead and deselect this by hitting Ctrl D on the keyboard. Then I'll bring up my rulers by hitting Ctrl R on the keyboard. Now why would I bring up my rulers? Well, I'm not going to be doing any measuring. That's a little too complicated in this situation. No, I'm pulling up the rulers because I can click inside them and drag out to create guides. And these guides aren't just a visual aid. they're actually magnetic, and any selection I make near them is automatically going to want to snap perfectly against them. I'll show you what I mean. I'll just make sure I have a guide on the left, on the right, on the top, and on the bottom. Now, using the elliptical marquee tool, I'll start clicking and dragging in the top left of the canvas. See how the guides are turning pink? That means the selection is snapping to them perfectly. I'll just continue dragging this out across the canvas till I get to the other side. There we go. There's an oval selection that matches perfectly with my canvas for my vignette. Now, to make the actual vignette, I'm going to go down to the bottom of the Layers panel, and instead of making a new layer effect, I'll click the New Adjustment Layer button. Then I'll select a new Curves layer. Okay, so now I have a new Curves adjustment layer with a layer mask cut from my selection. I'm going to go up in the Curves histogram and click somewhere in the middle of my diagonal line. Then I'll drag down and to the right. Okay, so this is making the inside of my oval darker. But I need to darken the outside of the oval for a proper vignette. I'll go over to the Layers panel and make sure that my layer mask is selected. Then I'll hit Ctrl-I on my keyboard to invert my mask. Perfect! Now the Curves layer is darkening the outer edges of the image like I wanted. Generally though, a vignette is supposed to be very soft. So to soften this, I'll just go over to the Layer Mask properties and pay attention to the feather option. I'm going to click this arrow and drag it to the right. This is feathering or blurring the edges of my layer mask. I'll leave this feather at 100 pixels. And there we go. There's another really easy way to make a simple vignette. I like the method of feathering the mask because I can always go back and change it however I like. I'm going to delete this layer mask so I can move on to my next method. Finally, the last method I'm going to show you is a little more hands-on, and it allows you maximum customization of the vignette. Right now, my Curves layer is still darkening my image, and since there's no more layer mask, it's darkening the entire image. I'm going to fix that by adding a new layer mask. I'll go down to the bottom of the Layers panel and click the New Layer Mask button. Then, with the layer mask selected, I'm going to hit Ctrl-I on my keyboard. This inverted the color of my layer mask from white to black. So now the mask is hiding my entire curves adjustment instead of showing it. Before I proceed, I'm just going to clean up my canvas a little bit. I'll hit Ctrl-R on my keyboard to hide the rulers. And then, to hide the guides, I'll go up to View, Show, Guides. I don't need the rulers or guides for this method because they're there to help me make my vignette perfect. But for this method, I want things to be a bit more natural looking, and that means it needs to be imperfect. Now I'll just zoom out of my canvas a little bit. I want a little more room because I'm going to be spending more time on the edges of my image. Then I'll go over to the Tools panel and get my brush tool. I'm going to go up to the tool options and bring up my brush size considerably, somewhere around 1000 pixels. I want a very large, soft brush, so I'll make sure the hardness is at 0%. And I'm going to use this brush to show areas of my mask, so I'll need to make sure that my brush is set to white. Then I'm just going to start manually brushing in the edges of my image, going around the outermost edges to show my layer mask and thus darken the image where I want the vignette to lie. One neat thing about this method is that I can switch to a black brush if I want to manually hide areas of the mask where I want the image to remain bright. And since I'm using a brush, I can always change the hardness of the brush if I want to, and even use custom brushes to achieve different styles. Okay, there's my final method for creating a vignette. We learned how to create a circular vignette with the gradient overlay layer effect. We learned how to create a perfect oval vignette with a curves layer and elliptical marquee tool. And finally, we learned how to create a fully custom vignette using a mask and a large, soft brush. That will do it for creating vignettes. I'll go over another effecting technique in the next video.